Some storms don't start with thunder, they begin with a name. Harrison Ford hadn't flown in over a decade, not since the world decided his time had passed. But one freezing night in Montana, the phone rang. And the voice on the other end only said 3 words: "She's gone missing." That was all it took. A storm began to rise, not in the sky, but in him, because some promises don't fade, they wait. Beneath the frost, beneath the silence, beneath the years. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, don't forget to subscribe. The storm hadn't arrived yet, not fully. But it was coming, rolling low across the Montana range like a slow tide of ice. Outside, snow began its quiet descent, tapping lightly against the windowpanes of a log cabin tucked into the woods like an afterthought. Inside, a fire burned low in the stone hearth, casting long shadows across worn furniture and shelves lined with aviation manuals thick with dust. Harrison Ford sat in silence, eyes half closed, listening to the creak of timber, the hum of a world about to go still. He held a mug of black coffee he hadn't sipped. On the wall above him, a faded photo in a cracked wooden frame showed a younger man, flight suit, wind-worn face, one hand resting on the nose of a Black Hawk helicopter. That man stared back with a look that knew the weight of silence. The phone rang once, then again. Ford didn't move until the third. He picked it up. "Dad," came a voice, ragged, breathless. "It's me, it's David." Ford straightened slightly. No words yet, just breath waiting. "They're missing." Ford's hand gripped the armrest. "Jess and Leela," the voice cracked. "They went out this morning, sledding, just the usual trail past the basin." A whiteout swept in. "I was supposed to meet them." The Rangers got one ping from her phone before it cut. That was 6 hours ago. Ford said nothing. The fire hissed softly behind him. Search and rescue logged it, but they're calling it unsafe. Visibility 0. Airspace grounded. They're not sending anyone in until morning if the weather breaks. Another long pause. "They're just sitting on it, Dad." Ford's voice came low. "What's the grid?" David exhaled, fumbling. "Sector Echo 7, North Ridge, near the drop below Sawyer's Point, you know it." Ford knew it. He had flown that line more times than he could count. Deep cuts, fast winds, cross currents that could throw a chopper into the rock face with one wrong pitch. "I tried calling her again. It goes straight to dead signal. If they're still alive out there." "They are," Ford said simply. The call ended. For a while he didn't move. Then he stood slowly, joints protesting in familiar ways. He crossed the room and opened a narrow drawer beneath the bookshelf. Inside was a folded map, creased from years of use, edges frayed. He laid it out on the kitchen table, flattening it with practiced hands. Sierra Nevada, elevation bands. Ridge lines, Sector Echo 7 marked faintly in red ink. He had drawn that circle himself once, years ago, when it was just theory and terrain memory. Now it was something else entirely. He reached for a pencil and began retracing the flight path. Not a safe one, not a standard one, but the way he would go. A route no one else would see unless they had flown it blind. In the silence that followed, the cabin seemed to tighten. The fire sputtered low. Outside, the snow thickened, curling around the windows like fingers. Ford stood in front of the photo on the wall and looked at it for a long time. The man in the picture had once been cleared for impossible missions. Now he wasn't cleared for anything at all, but the coordinates were still burned into his bones. The sky hadn't forgotten him, and he hadn't forgotten how to read the sky. He rolled the map tightly and slid it into his old canvas satchel. As he moved toward the back room, his shadow passed the window, and for a brief second, it looked like a ghost stepping back into the world. The storm was coming. But someone had to fly. The hangar hadn't changed. Maybe the world outside had, but in here, beneath rusting girders and the echo of decades-old footfalls, it was still the same, cold, dim, and humming faintly with the weight of things left behind. Harrison Ford stepped into the space like a man returning to a memory, not a place. The concrete floor was slick with frost, and the air smelled of oil, steel, and silence. In the far corner, cloaked in a heavy gray tarp and dust thick enough to write names in, sat the Beechcraft Baron. Twin engine, nose slightly tilted from a flattened front tire, she looked asleep. He stood in front of her without speaking, just breathing. A mechanic glanced up from across the hangar, young, maybe 25, clipboard in hand and suspicion already rising in his eyes. He took a step forward, hesitating. "Sir, this hangar's restricted access. You're not supposed to be." Ford ignored him, walked past, unhurried. The tarp crinkled like dry leaves as he peeled it back, revealing the curved metal skin of the fuselage. The logo near the tail had faded with sun and time. The mechanic cleared his throat louder this time. "I can report this, you know, I have to. If you're planning to fly." Ford didn't stop moving. "Not yet," he said. His hand moved along the wing, fingers brushing the rivets like counting prayers. "You sure you're cleared?" the kid asked again, more nervous now than assertive. Ford didn't answer. Somewhere behind him, the sound of snow against the hangar roof picked up. A ticking rhythm, cold breath pressing in, and in that moment, a memory surfaced, not loud or bright, just soft and steady. A few mornings ago, no storm. Just blue sky and the quiet hum of bees. Leela had been playing in the back garden, tugging at his arm until he sat with her under the shade of the pine tree. She held one of his old flight maps, unfolded messily across the ground. Her finger jabbed at colored circles like she knew what they meant. "This one's where the pirates live," she grinned, "and here's the volcano planet." He laughed then, he remembered that, and she turned suddenly serious. "Grandpa," she said, "can girls be pilots?" Ford looked at her. The sunlight caught her cheek, and she looked like her grandmother in that moment, bright, defiant, unstoppable. "Girls can do anything," he said, "but flying's not about being allowed. It's about knowing why you have to." She frowned a little. "What if they tell me I can't?" "Then don't wait for permission," he told her. "Some runways you light yourself." The memory faded as the wind rattled the hangar doors again. He opened the cockpit now, easing into the pilot's seat with a slowness that wasn't weakness, just reverence. Everything still fit. The controls, the panel, the muscle memory. He sat there a while, eyes half closed, breathing in the silence like it was air from another time. A pair of footsteps approached from the rear hangar doors, steady, deliberate. An older voice followed. "You know, this could make sure you never fly again." Ford looked up. A man in a navy overcoat stood watching him, ranked, weathered, the kind of face you see in back rooms of base meetings. Ford said nothing, just turned back to the panel. "They'll pull every clearance you have left," the man added, "if they haven't already." Ford's voice came after a beat, quiet and matter-of-fact. "I haven't flown in almost 10 years. He paused, fingers brushing the edge of the yoke. "But not a day's passed I didn't think about it." The man didn't respond. He just watched him there, in the quiet, with the snow pressing in and the old Beechcraft breathing softly like it remembered what it was made for. Ford stood slowly, gripping the edge of the hatch. "Tell whoever you need to," he said, "but don't try to stop me." The man didn't move. Ford walked past him without a backward glance, the tarp left half off. The plane, no longer asleep. The checklist ran through Harrison's head like scripture. Fuel, pressure, throttle alignment. No GPS, no tower clearance, no satellite sync. Just analog dials and a paper map taped to the dashboard, edges curled, corners marked in red ink he'd drawn himself years ago. The wind outside moaned low through the cracked panels of the hangar. Somewhere far above, the mountains were already disappearing into white. He moved methodically, gloves off, hands bare against metal and switch. His breath was steady, but inside the cockpit, something quieter pulsed beneath the silence. Memory, intuition, a pilot's instinct not dulled by time, only kept waiting. He reached for the magneto switch when a voice sliced the air behind him. "You planning to kill yourself, or just hoping for the option?" Ford turned. David stood near the hangar door, snow crusted on his jacket, his face pale with anger and something harder to name. "Because this," David gestured to the plane, to the storm, to the map taped beside the seat, "this looks like a suicide note with wings." Ford said nothing, just looked at him. "You think you're the only one who wants them back." David snapped. "You think being a legend gives you the right to fly through hell because you can't accept the world's changed." Harrison exhaled once. "This isn't about the world." "Then what?" David stepped closer. "You left us half the time growing up. You were in the sky more than you were at the table. And now you think what, this is redemption, one last run to make up for all of it." The words landed like thrown gravel, sharp, familiar. Ford didn't flinch. He just glanced at the storm building outside. It's not redemption if it's the only thing you can do. You're 82, David hissed. You haven't flown a mission in years. Your reflexes aren't the same. This isn't some field test, Dad. It's death. Then let it be mine, Ford said softly. David stared at him, the rage drained not into forgiveness, but into something brittle, tired. You don't get to make this decision for all of us. Ford nodded once. You're right. Then he leaned back into the cockpit and flipped the ignition test switch. The soft hum of life began crawling through the fuselage, not a roar, not yet, just a whisper. David stood still, fists at his sides. Then slowly he reached for his backpack. From inside he pulled a small silver device, dented, scuffed, with a single red LED blinking faintly. Leela had this in her coat, he said. Emergency signal, range barely a mile on good days, but I got a pulse, 30 seconds, then it died. He handed it to his father. You said Echo 7, right? That ridge has a dead zone, but if we can get close enough. Ford took the device. The light had stopped blinking, but the plastic was warm. Someone had touched it recently. He looked at David. You coming? David didn't answer at first. He just moved toward the passenger side of the cockpit, pulled the headset from the hook, and sat. You're gonna need someone who can still read digital if this goes south. Ford allowed the faintest nod. Then stow the guilt. We've got 6 minutes before the low front eats visibility to zero. How will you even find the ridge? Terrain mapping, dead reckoning, and a little luck. And if that doesn't work, Ford slid the window open slightly. The wind screamed like a warning. Then I listened to the sky. David looked at him like he wasn't sure whether that was madness or memory. Then he strapped in. Outside, the snow fell heavier now, blanketing the runway in uneven drifts. There were no other aircraft moving, no ground crew, no clearance. Just two figures in a plane no one had touched in a decade, readying for a flight no one had approved. The engines coughed once, then again. On the third turn they caught a low rumble, a slow breath awakening. Ford gripped the yoke. His hands didn't shake. Let's go find her, he said, and the Beechcraft rolled forward into the white. The sky didn't open. It vanished. One moment there had been outlines, trees, ridges, the suggestion of earth and distance, and the next only white, not soft or quiet, but endless swallowing. The Beechcraft climbed into it like a diver into deep water, engines steady, wings braced. No tower response, no beacons, just static across the comms and the low hum of old circuits trying to remember what clarity felt like. Inside the cockpit, Harrison Ford kept his eyes forward. The instruments flickered, then went dark on the second panel. Backup nav gone, no surprise. They were too deep into the front now. David sat stiffly beside him, eyes flicking between the dials and the windshield that showed nothing but a blur of snow sweeping sideways like angry ash. We lost nav, David muttered. We are blind. We were blind 10 minutes ago, Ford said. This just confirms it. The plane jolted suddenly, a sideways punch from a crosswind that slammed the right wing and sent them listing 5 degrees. David grabbed the edge of the seat. Ford adjusted without a word, pitch, trim, throttle pull. The plane leveled again, groaning like it didn't appreciate the correction. Outside, the storm howled louder. The left stabilizer shuddered. Something hit us, David said. Not hit, Ford replied. Ripped. He toggled a side camera. The image came in with static, but enough showed. A strip of the outer flap had torn loose. Not catastrophic. Not yet. David looked at him. Should we turn back? Ford didn't answer. He tapped the barometer, squinted, then nodded toward the window. See the snowline pattern? It's slanting off-center. That's updraft on the edge. If we hit the vortex right, we can slip under it. Ride the curl. The curl. 3 minutes, Ford said. If we're late by 10 seconds, we're in the downdraft. That's death. David stared at him. And if we're early, Ford adjusted altitude slightly. Then we miss the path completely, also death. The silence that followed wasn't fear. It was calculation. The kind of silence only pilots knew. Outside, the wind screamed again, louder now, shaking the cabin with each gust. Ford's knuckles whitened on the yoke. The plane dropped 70 feet, then steadied. David glanced at the analog map still taped to the dash, following his father's scrawled annotations. Red arrows, circles, handwritten codes, memory routes. Then he heard it, a faint chirp. Not a system alert, not interference. It came from his backpack. He opened the side pocket fast. The little transmitter, Leela's, the toy-sized emergency ping Ford had given her years ago. It blinked once, a single red pulse, then again. Faint, weak, but there. I've got something, David said. Ping just came through. Ford's eyes stayed on the windshield, but his voice dropped lower. Range, could be a mile, 2 if the wind's helping. Direction, David turned the device. It blinked again, this time a little stronger. Off our current bearing, west-northwest. Ford said nothing, just looked at the sky like it owed him a favor, then he banked hard left. The Beechcraft tilted into the white, wings slicing through horizontal ice like knives through cloth. We follow it, he said, until it dies. And if it dies before we reach her, Ford didn't blink, then we'll fly where it last spoke. Because if it spoke at all, she's still alive. The storm rose up to meet them. The engines held, barely, 10 minutes. That's all the signal would give them, and maybe that's all they had. The Beechcraft roared through the corridor between ridgelines, but there was no sky to see. Only a smothering blanket of white pressed against the windshield, so thick it blurred shape and distance into a single overwhelming blur. The plane rattled as crosswinds slammed the fuselage. Ice was starting to form at the edges of the windshield, creeping in thin veins across the glass like frostbite reaching for bone. Harrison Ford leaned forward, squinting through the small patch the defroster kept barely clear. His fingers moved across the yoke with care, not too much correction, not too little. He wasn't flying by sight anymore. He was flying by feel. David tapped the transmitter again. Nothing, no light, no chirp. The signal had died somewhere behind them. We lost it, he muttered. Last pulse was 3 minutes ago. Then that's where we're going, Ford replied. You don't even know where that is, David said. It was a toy transmitter with a quarter-mile range. We could be 10 miles off. We're not, Ford said, adjusting throttle. I know this valley. From 20 years ago, David shot back. Terrain shifts, snow buries trails, you can't navigate by memory. Watch me. David looked at his father, really looked. The calm was unsettling, not because it lacked fear, but because it had something deeper, conviction, the kind that didn't waver even when everything else did. What if you're wrong? He asked. What if we get there and there's nothing? No one? What if they're already gone and we're just flying into a grave? Ford didn't flinch. If I'm right, they live. If I'm wrong, they don't die alone. The silence that followed didn't belong to the storm. It belonged to the space between two people who both loved the same child but carried different kinds of hope. The wind howled again, harder this time, shaking the Beechcraft's wings. Warning lights flickered on the panel. David's eyes darted across the gauges. Engine temps dropping, he said. Starboard intake may be icing. Feather it, Ford replied. David reached for the control. The vibration shifted slightly, but the left engine still held strong. They were running on half power now and gaining elevation only by inches. Ford banked the plane slightly right, angling along the spine of the range. The altimeter ticked down. They had to stay low, too high and they'd vanish into full whiteout, too low and they'd meet rock. We are flying blind, David whispered. No nav, no heat, one engine. You realize this is insane. This is necessary, Ford said. That's not the same thing. It is when they're waiting. The words were simple, but they landed heavy. David didn't respond. Outside, ice began to crust along the wing edge. A chunk broke loose with a metallic snap, spiraling past the window before vanishing. Ford's eyes narrowed. He tilted the plane slightly again, easing into the next valley, shallower, narrower, but familiar. A basin. He'd flown medevacs here during a fire season long past. There was a cut in the ridgeline, a break barely visible through the storm. There, he said, we'll drop through that gap. You can't even see it. I don't have to. The plane dipped lower, alarms beeped. The vibration grew worse. The second engine began to sputter. David leaned forward. We have 5 minutes of flight time at this rate. Then we find them in 4. You're gambling with both our lives. I'm trading mine for theirs. For a long moment, David said nothing. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small photo, creased, damp at the edges. Leela wearing goggles, arms around a stuffed bear, smiling with teeth missing. He handed it to Ford. "Don't miss." Ford glanced at the photo, then back to the storm, his jaw clenched. The snow thickened again, now in horizontal streaks that slammed the windshield like salt spray, but something shifted in the current, a break, a slight downdraft where there shouldn't be one. Ford felt it before he saw it. He adjusted the angle by instinct, and suddenly, just for a second, the white parted, a dark patch, maybe rock, maybe shelter, maybe nothing, but it was something different, a landmark. Ford pointed. "That's where we go." "It's not on any map," David said. "No," Ford replied, "but it's burned into my memory." The plane descended, both men silent now, no guarantees, no backup. Just the air, the noise, and the fading heat of something they refused to lose. The canyon opened like a wound in the earth, narrow, sharp-edged, frozen under layers of windblown snow and black ice. The Beechcraft came in low, engines straining, the airframe groaning with every adjustment. Harrison Ford gripped the yoke with one hand, the other dancing across switches, easing the bird sideways. There was no runway, no flat ground, just a jagged shelf on the mountainside, angled at 30 degrees, half buried under snow. It wasn't a landing zone, it was a gamble, but it was the only one they had. There, David pointed, below them, half obscured by white, a flash of color, red, a jacket, then another shape smaller, curled close to the first. "That's them." Ford nodded. "Brace for wind shear." The snow churned around them as the plane banked again, lowering gear. The right wheel caught first, skidding sideways. The plane tilted, shrieked, metal grinding against buried rock. The fuselage jerked as the rear wheels touched down, bouncing once before catching just enough traction to hold. The engines roared. Ford fought the controls like they were alive. The Beechcraft didn't land so much as it clawed onto the mountain and stayed there. "We've got minutes," Ford said, unbuckling. "She won't sit still long." David was already grabbing the medkit and thermal wraps. He slid open the side hatch and was swallowed by wind and white. Ford stayed in the cockpit, eyes on the gauges, feet steady on the pedals. The engine trembled beneath him. Warning lights pulsed again, temperature drop, torque imbalance, ice accumulation. He kept one hand on the throttle, the other on the stick. Outside, David moved through waist-deep snow, pushing forward against a slope that threatened to pull him sideways with every step. The shapes became clearer now. Jess, his wife, slumped against a rock, her leg twisted unnaturally, face pale and blood crusted at her temple. Her eyes opened slowly. "David," she gasped. "Leela." David dropped to his knees beside her. "I've got you, where S?" Then he saw her, curled under her mother's arm, barely moving, face flushed with cold, eyes half closed. David touched her cheek. It was too cold. "She's still breathing," he said, more to himself than anyone. He pulled the thermal wraps tight around her, lifted her gently into his arms. Jess groaned as he tried to move her. "I'll come back," he promised. "Stay awake, please." He turned and began the climb back, snow now falling in sheets. Above, Ford's voice crackled through the headset. "We've got a shift on the ridge. Avalanche risk just spiked." "I'm halfway," David panted. 10 seconds. Make it 5. Ford's eyes darted to the upper slope. The snowpack had started to slide, slow at first, then faster. A rumble built beneath the wind, low and gathering like distant thunder. David stumbled once, caught himself. The hatch opened just as the first wave of snow broke free from the ridge. He shoved Leela into the cabin. "Go," he shouted. Not without her. David dove back into the white. The storm screamed around him now. Ford adjusted pitch, keeping the plane steady. The skids groaned under pressure. 3 seconds, he whispered. David reappeared, dragging Jess under the arms, slipping. The slope behind him fractured, snow dropping in sheets. He reached the hatch. Ford leaned over and hauled Jess in by the collar. David followed, slammed the hatch shut. Now, Ford hit the throttle. The Beechcraft lurched, wheels spinning against slick stone. The avalanche hit seconds later, slamming into the mountain like a freight train. The blast of snow and wind rocked the plane sideways. The rear gear caught something beneath the surface and twisted. The plane lifted, then dipped, nose up, tail skidding. Then it dropped, 3 seconds of freefall, the cabin tilted. David shouted, Jess screamed, Ford closed his eyes. He let go of thought and moved by instinct, nose down. Trim hard left, flaps full. The world spun, then stopped. The engines caught, the plane leveled. They were airborne, barely. Inside the cockpit, silence returned like a slow breath. Ford opened his eyes, the yoke still in his hands. The Beechcraft climbed through the white, shuddering but rising. Behind them, the avalanche swallowed the shelf they had left seconds before. Gone, erased. Jess lay unconscious, her hand gripping David's sleeve. Leela curled beneath a blanket, eyes closed but cheeks flushing with returning warmth. David looked at his father. You saved us." Ford didn't answer. He kept the bird steady, altitude rising. His hands trembled now, not from fear. From everything he'd held off until this moment. His voice came low, "We're not home yet." The storm was still alive, but so were they, and that was enough for now. The landing strip at the rescue station wasn't expecting them. No signal, no ground crew on standby, no blinking lights to guide them home. Just wind curling along the tarmac and snow still whispering across concrete, erasing tire marks as fast as they were made. The Beechcraft came in low, its landing gear groaning beneath the uneven weight of bent metal and patched power. One engine sputtered on final approach. The rear wheel, twisted from the mountain shelf, dragged slightly, threatening to snap. Harrison Ford kept the nose level, hands firm on the yoke, eyes locked forward. No radio clearance, no voice telling him wind speed, just instinct and a half-broken bird limping back from somewhere no one was supposed to go. The plane kissed the ground with a heavy bounce, skidded, tilted left, then held. A long exhale moved through the frame. Inside the tower, someone finally stood. A rescue tech knocked over his coffee, reaching for binoculars. Outside, the emergency bay door opened as medics stepped out, confused, unprepared. The plane rolled to a halt near the edge of the lot. The engines wound down, sputtering to a stop like a runner collapsing at the finish line. For a beat, no one moved. Then the hatch opened. David stepped out first, half carrying Jess, who was still unconscious, her leg wrapped in a makeshift brace. A medic ran forward, stammering into his radio. Behind them, Ford climbed down slowly, one hand steadying the ladder, the other pressing against the side of the fuselage like he needed to feel the plane still beneath him. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The rescue crew stared like they were seeing something not quite real, a legend stepping off a ghost. One of the younger responders pulled his supervisor aside. "There's no flight record," he whispered. "No transponder ping. Nothing in the manifest. That plane wasn't logged in the system today." "What do you mean?" the supervisor asked. "I mean," the tech replied, voice low, "officially, that aircraft never left the ground." Further back, a second medic murmured to a colleague, watching Ford walk past the stunned crowd. "Who flew that?" The question hung in the cold. No one answered, but someone inside the tower had already started reviewing the external security footage. It was low resolution, black and white, mostly static, but frame by frame, the landing played out. Then the camera on the approach runway caught something else. A brief moment inside the cockpit during the final descent. Turbulence was at its worst. The plane tilted hard right. The pilot, silhouetted against flashing warning lights, released one hand from the yoke, reached across, adjusted pitch, corrected for wind drift, all in a single motion. One hand flying the aircraft through chaos, calm, exact, focused. The timestamp showed it was seconds before touchdown. The camera angle blurred, then cleared just enough to freeze the frame. A profile. The braid of a headset cord coiled behind his ear. The lines of an old jacket, worn through at the elbow. No helmet, no co-pilot helping in that moment. Just one man in a seat no one had approved. The clip was saved. Someone tagged it ghost tape before sending it to internal review. It was forwarded, and forwarded again. By nightfall, the base commander had received a copy. No commentary, no subject line, just a file, 17 seconds long. By then, Ford was sitting alone in the far end of the med station. His jacket draped over a chair, steam rising from the cup of tea someone had left beside him. He said nothing. He watched through the window as Leela stirred in her cot and reached for her father's hand. It wasn't victory, it wasn't glory, but it was enough. And out there, in systems and servers and whispered conversations, a story had already begun. Not on a manifest, not in the official log, but in the space between silence and survival, a flight that never should have happened, flown by the man they thought never would again. The snow had stopped by morning. What remained was a thin glaze of frost across the tarmac and a silence that hung low over the airfield like fog refusing to lift. The Beechcraft sat parked near the edge of the lot, its fuselage streaked with salt and soot, wing flaps crusted with remnants of the storm. The engines were silent now, the smell of scorched metal slowly fading into the cold. Harrison Ford sat beside the left wing, jacket collar turned up, hands folded. He wasn't looking at the plane. He was looking past it, beyond the tower, beyond the mountain line, into something only he could see. Behind the windows of the med station, Leela slept under warm blankets, her chest rising steady. Jess lay beside her, bruised but breathing. And inside that room, the pieces of a family were slowly, quietly, beginning to stitch back together. David sat next to him now, a thermos in hand, both men watching the runway without speaking. There were no lectures, no apologies, just stillness, and the weight of everything that had come before. For once, the silence between them didn't feel like a wall, it felt like understanding. A low crunch of boots on frost broke the quiet. A young man, maybe 20, stood a few feet away, rescue uniform still half unzipped, gloves tucked under one arm. His voice was soft when he spoke. "Sir, you're the reason I signed up for flight training." Ford glanced at him, then looked away. "Don't follow ghosts," he said. "Follow the sky." The boy nodded, unsure if it was permission or a warning. He stepped back. Then he turned and walked away, the frost cracking gently beneath his steps. For a while there was nothing, just the morning light pulling faint shadows across the plain. Then another figure appeared. Slower, older, a man in a dark overcoat, silver bars at the collar, shoes too clean for snow. He didn't rush. He walked with the kind of weight that said he wasn't here to offer congratulations, just consequence. He stopped in front of Ford and held out an envelope. Thick, sealed. "Nobody's going to ask you to do anything," he said. "Not after last night, but if you choose to, that's a direct reinstatement. Special Command Override, Tier 1. Ford looked at it, then at the man, then back at the horizon. "You're late," he said. "Always were." The officer didn't smile. "This isn't about politics, not anymore." Ford nodded. "That's why I'm not interested. You flew into a no-go zone without clearance, with a crippled aircraft, and you brought back 2 civilians alive, one of them a child. And we both know you should have never made it through that storm." Ford stood slowly, his knees clicked, his shoulder groaned, but his back stayed straight. He looked at the envelope again. "I didn't fly because I had permission," he said. "I flew because I made a promise." The officer held the envelope a moment longer, then tucked it back inside his coat. "If you change your mind, Hangar 6 is always warm." Then he turned and walked away, leaving only footprints and quiet. Ford exhaled. It wasn't relief, just release. He turned back toward the plane, ran a hand along the wing edge. The metal was still cold, but it remembered. Machines always do, they carry the pressure. The strain, the stories no one else was cleared to know. Behind him, David stood, watching. "You're not done, are you?" Ford didn't answer, not right away. He looked toward the med station window. Leela had stirred, a small hand pressed to the glass. Her eyes found his, no words, just that look, like the world had tilted back into place. He lifted a hand slowly, palm out. She mimicked him, tiny fingers against the glass. Then she smiled, and everything else faded. The storm, the frost, the flight that shouldn't have happened, none of it mattered as much as that. Ford turned back to the tarmac, the sky above him finally clear, not empty, not silent, just waiting. He didn't need the envelope. He didn't need permission. He had already proven what needed to be said. The only thing left was to listen, and when the sky called again, he would know, because some promises outlast the storm. And some pilots were never grounded. They were just waiting for the right moment to take off again. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.